Hello all, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and our partners from New England and around the world. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Tim Green, the trustee liaison of TNC in Massachusetts, and I'll be your host today. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have a really exciting program for you today. We'll be discussing how TNC is working with partners to create a searchable database of seabird restoration efforts that will help speed attempts to save seabirds as the planet continues to warm. We'll hear from Nick Holmes, Island Resilience Strategy Lead for TNC in California, and Alex Wegmann, Lead Scientist for TNC's Island Resilience Strategy, about how sharing information will increase the scale and pace of conservation for the most imperiled avian fauna on Earth. So before we dive into today's program, I wanted to share a little bit about our guests. Firstly, Dr. Nick Holmes is the Island Resilience Strategy Lead for TNC's California chapter and a conservation scientist with 17+ years of experience, directing innovative NGO and university research programs to inform strategic decision-making to maximize conservation benefit. His work involves human-wildlife interactions, invasive species, threatened species, and island ecosystems. He has authored more than 70 peer-reviewed publications in these areas, is a member of the Science Advisory Council for the NGO Island Conservation, an associate editor of the journal Biological Invasions, and member of the IUCN Invasive Species Specialist Group. Dr. Alex Wegmann is the lead scientist for TNC's Island Resilience Strategy and a conservation scientist and practitioner with more than 20 years experience. His work is in the thematic areas of land-sea connectivity, invasive species, ecological restoration, marine conservation, and the application of biotechnology-based solutions to conservation challenges. Alex serves on the board of directors for Pacific Rim Conservation, a US 501c3 conservation-focused organization protecting bird species throughout the Pacific region. Alex founded TNC's Climate Adaptation and Resilience Laboratory, which leverages TNC's preserve and inholding at Palmyra Atoll National Wildlife Refuge to develop and scale solutions for island, coral reef, and ocean conservation challenges. Now, as you think of questions for Nick and Alex, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks so much again for joining us today. And Nick and Alex, I think I can welcome you on camera here, and we can just go ahead and dive into your presentation.
Thank you, Tim, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me quickly share my screen here. All right. Well, we are really excited. Alex and I are very excited to be here to talk to you about some very important and very impactful work that we've been fortunate enough to be involved in. And as Tim alluded to, this work it centers on some very real, very definable local actions, but counting them and measuring them at a global scale. What is the impact of these local conservation actions at a global scale? So our story is about seabirds, but really any story about seabirds is a story about islands. And I'd like to take just a few moments to tell you about the Island Resilience Strategy and why TNC is choosing to invest in this space. And when we look at islands across the globe, we find that if you put all that landmass into a bucket, it only adds up to about 5%. However, we can see that there's a disproportionately higher rate of our bird biodiversity, of our threatened vertebrates on the IUCN Red List. And in the last 500 years, it's also where we've had the vast majority of our extinctions. And so islands are a really important conservation need. And for a conservation organization like TNC, it means that you get a high return on investment if you focus on islands as a place to do good work. It's not all doom and gloom though. While islands are indeed a place of high conservation need, it turns out that some of the most remarkable conservation achievements we've had on our planet have been on islands. Simply said, having a moat or a body of water around these islands means we can do things that we couldn't otherwise do on the mainland. And so by way of example, the images in front of you, this is Santa Cruz Island in the Channel Islands of California. And I hope that many of you have had the chance or will get the chance to come and see these remarkable places. And the Nature Conservancy invested in purchasing Santa Cruz Island several decades ago. And at the time, it was deeply embedded in a ranching history, which had led to a significant loss of habitat and species on the island. And within the space of a decade, the Nature Conservancy was able to turn this around by removing the key threats like invasives and beginning the process of habitat restoration. And it's been wildly successful. And we know these actions are occurring on other islands around the world as well. So, not all doom and gloom, it's actually a really good opportunity. When we look at a global scale though, the challenge that we see is that although we know we can do good things on islands, the pace of this conservation implementation is not fast enough in order to meet the scale of the challenge. And so this is the key part of the equation that we know we need to change. It's the speed, the uptake of conservation tools and conservation strategies on islands. And so this is why TNC here in California and across the Pacific, we've invested in an island resilience strategy. And we have 3 pillars that we're attempting to tackle. One is building big conservation visions. 2 is facilitating policy and science innovation. And this is a part of what we'll be talking about today with the Seabird Restoration Database. And the 3rd is supporting priority conservation delivery. And I'm happy that we can share with you today some examples of seabird restoration that TNC is involved in. So, back to our main characters. You can see that with TNC thinking about islands and TNC having a history of owning islands and shedding blood on islands in order to achieve a conservation outcome, we are really well positioned to think about that. And when we look at islands, seabirds are a natural ambassador for us to work with. They are both in need of conservation, but they are also conservation partners. And despite islands, for many people, when they think about islands, they are very small. Seabirds connect islands across vast oceanic landscapes, like this bird here. This is the Laysan albatross. And the vast majority of this population breeds out in the northwest Hawaiian Islands, Midway Atoll in particular. But this bird ranges all across the North Pacific in order to forage and bring food back to chicks on the nest. And we regularly see them here in the California current as they undertake those trips to 7-Eleven. And when we look at seabirds, we can very easily see they are emblematic of some of the problems and some of the threats that occur on islands. The images that you're looking at, this is Laysan Island in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. And in 1902, you can see that it was a flourishing landscape and host to, these are also Laysan albatross in this black and white image. Rabbits were introduced to the island. It was a deliberate introduction. And around the turn of the century, there was the haberdashery industry, and collecting feathers from seabirds and collecting eggs was a thriving industry. The intrepid haberdashery people that went to these islands would bring other food sources with them, including rabbits. Rabbits ate everything on the island. They have all the vegetation, and we lost 3 species. There were 3 extinctions on our planet on Laysan Island because of the impacts of people and the introduction of rabbits. And so here you can see what happened accordingly. I'm pleased to say there are no longer rabbits on Laysan, and Laysan albatross and others have returned. However, those extinctions are permanent, as we know. So something that's emerged in the last couple of decades in the global conservation scene is creating new seabird colonies. And another word for this is translocations, conservation translocations. And these are attempts to build new colonies in places that where colonies were lost. So an example would be Laysan Island, or in some cases in entirely new places. Now, the reasons for doing this are typically to recover threatened species. And you can see a picture of me there. I'm holding a bird that I worked with for many years in Hawaii. This is the Newell's shearwater, which is a globally threatened species. And we're in the process of building a new colony in order to create an insurance population effectively. Another really important reason that people create new seabird colonies is to restore ecosystem functions. So seabirds are essentially engineers of island environments, and this puffin in front of you is doing something really important from a functional perspective. It is transferring marine nutrients into the terrestrial environment. So basic seabird ecology, as we all know, seabirds forage at sea. A couple of exceptions like gulls, but humor me for a moment. In collecting and foraging fish and squid, they will bring that back to their location where they breed. They'll either drop fish, they'll defecate, or they'll die on the island. And this leads to this transfer of marine nutrients. This is just one of the many ways that seabirds are engineers of island environments, and people seek to restore them in order to bring back natural functioning. And of course, another very important reason as we look down the barrel of our very different future is creating populations in locations where we can create climate resilience. We need sites where seabirds can persist, either because their original colonies are going to be lost due to sea level rise or storm surge, or because their foraging dynamics are going to change, and these birds need to be better positioned in order to access their forage. In terms of how new seabird colonies are done, it falls into two basic categories. One is social attraction, and the other is chick translocation. Now, seabirds are typically very colonial breeders, meaning that if there's one, there's often going to be many, and you can leverage that breeding behavior if you use sound systems, and we lovingly call them seabird discotheques. If you create a big speaker and you blast seabird calls, you can often get a response. And for some seabirds at the right time, in the right place, you can actually just bring them down with your own voice. They will respond to you. And for some birds, it's about decoys. There's a very visual component to this breeding behavior. And so you can lure them in and attract them to a location. And very generally, you can see on the left, that's an image at night. And for many birds, their breeding behavior occurs at night. And that means that you don't necessarily have to look good, but you have to sound good. And here's some examples. So what you can hear, that's a storm petrel calling. And that's essentially pillow talk. What we are broadcasting on these sound systems is pillow talk in an effort to convince new birds, prospecting birds, that this is a good place to come down and check it out. And likewise with the albatross there, with your keen eyes, I'm sure you can pick out the fake albatross. Albatrosses are diurnal breeders. This is why they often look good. And we need to use visual stimuli to bring that down. Another tool that we use, especially with terns, are mirrors. Terns love to sit in front of a mirror and they will preen themselves and go through breeding behavior. The second major way that we create seabird colonies is through chick translocation. Now, sometimes you can't lure a bird in. If there's nobody around to hear your seabird discotheque or see your decoys, then perhaps the birds won't come in. And a more significant investment in time is to physically move birds. And this is a little bit more common amongst the petrels and the shearwaters and the albatrosses. And what you can do is by moving chicks under a certain age, they will imprint on a new location and return to that location once it's time for them to breed. So this is how you go about creating new seabird colonies. By way of example, so earlier I mentioned Santa Cruz Island here in California. Another place that Alex and I are very fortunate to work is TNC's Palmyra Atoll. And on Palmyra Atoll, we're in the process of going through a rainforest restoration project. And this project began more than a decade ago, really, where rats were eradicated from the island. We're now in the process of restoring some of the vegetation on the island. And a key part of this is bringing back the birds that we know were lost because of the rat introductions many, many years ago. And here's an example of one of the caster characters that we'd like to encourage to return home with our decoys. We have sound systems, mirrors, and we have decoys out, and we're already getting some positive responses of new visitors to this location. So we're here to talk about a global database. So a key thing for us is to attempt to take these conservation interventions and promote them and see the uptake of these interventions at a faster scale, at a faster pace and a broader scale across places that could be done. And the best way to do that is to look and try and inventory all the efforts around the world and say, look, here's what's been done, and it can be successful with a broad number of species. And we also have the added value of connecting practitioners. So by creating sort of a phone book, if you like, of all these interventions, we're able to help new practitioners or existing practitioners repeat this work and do it again and again and again. This is all publicly available, and Lauren will send around to you a link that that goes to the database, and you can explore some of these yourself. If you click on a point, you can see the bird that was moved, who was involved, the location, etc., etc. And so what's really exciting is we can see more than 800 restoration events around the world. And we were really pleasantly surprised to learn that there was so much of this going on. Now, these kinds of inventories, if you like, are quite time consuming because we have to find out who to talk to and learn from them. And not everything is in the published literature or in a report or on Twitter. We have to go and broadcast our intent within different conservation communities, and then we have to go and talk to people. So when you look here at these numbers, this is the result of a whole lot of work in order, particularly including talking to seabird practitioners around the world in an attempt to pull this together. And this is a really important gap in the conservation community, is learning what's happened elsewhere. What's the best way to achieve that? And so this reflects the work that TNC and Alex and myself are investing in. It's both the science innovation in order to develop a knowledge base that will allow us to increase the pace and scale of seabird restoration as a key part of improving the resilience of islands. Along the way, TNC owns and manages several islands themselves, and we partner with a number of agencies and private parties around the world on islands. And so we're doing a lot of the priority conservation delivery as well. We find that this is a really important part of the work that we're doing. So this is my last slide, and I point out that we are looking forward to continuing this work, and we have a good deal of work in front of us. And so we do have a gap in funding that we're looking to fill of about $200,000. And so I'd be excited to learn if there's opportunities to work with any of you to fill that gap. So let me stop here. I'll close down my slideshow. And Tim, I'll hand it back over to you.
Oh, excuse me. So we can now dive into some audience questions. So just as a reminder for folks, as you think of questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And that is different than the chat. The Q&A will help us to see your question quicker. So just to start off, Nick and Alex, I am interested, you were talking about seabirds as ambassadors of islands. And, at TNC, at least in TNC in Massachusetts, I know we talk a lot about creating a resilient and connected network of lands and waters that will support plants and animals as the climate changes. And so the big example for that for us in the Northeast is the Appalachians. So I'm curious, is that like a similar approach that's taken of trying to find islands that are, placed just so or have the right climate that it's really, getting a big bang for our buck when we invest in conservation strategies?
Yeah, it is. It is. And I can give an example here in California, and Alex, maybe you could talk about the Line Islands, for example. But here, the analog here in California of the Appalachians would be the California Current. And so the California Current extends up the west coast of North America there, and the islands are dotted along there. And they are a natural body of connectivity, if you like. From an evolutionary perspective, you can see a lot of similarities in the life history of both the plants, the inverts, and the animals. And then for animals that are mobile, like seabirds, there's a great deal of connectivity. And you can see that all the way down to their phylogeny, but also into their foraging behavior, how they interact between the spaces between the islands. So yes, is the answer. And we have a similar outcome occurring in the Line Islands.
Yeah, hello everybody, Alex Wegmann here. As Nick just stated, the Line Islands, it's a really interesting archipelago. It's about 1,000 miles south of the main Hawaiian Islands. And it's a north to south chain of marine volcanoes that have mostly subsided. So what is left are atolls and low-lying islands within that chain. And the northernmost two features are US territories. So it's Palmyra Atoll and Kingman Reef. And then south of that, all of the geologic features, the marine volcanoes, are within the island nation of Kiribati, except for one more. The US has one more of those islands, Jarvis Island, which is a few islands down the chain. But the reason I bring up that sort of geopolitical context is that not only are there sort of conservation benefits to thinking of these conservation challenges from a landscape or land seascape perspective, from a whole archipelago or an entire mountain range, but also we need to take into consideration the politics of this. Mm-hmm. And how do we work with, not only how do we work with the species, but how do we work with the jurisdictions and the nations that are responsible for caring for and managing the species. So that's a really interesting component of our work in the Pacific. And what we have going on the Line Islands is with Palmyra Atoll, which Nick showed to you, is a Nature Conservancy preserve within a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge. We are the only predator-free habitat in the Northern Line Islands for seabirds. And so what we represent is a special conservation case where we can safeguard and protect species there that are declining throughout the rest of the range. And we can do that while we simultaneously work with our international partners to provide better habitat and better protection for the seabirds throughout that archipelago.
Awesome. And I'm seeing in the chat here, this is great from Ariel Santos. I sent in my project to the database a few months ago. We are working to restore and safeguard critical nesting habitats for common and roseate terns in the face of sea level rise and human disturbance on Long Island, New York. Looks forward to learning more from you all. So that's awesome. So glad that you could join us, Ariel. And so I have a question also here from Bill Fleming. The introduction of wolves into the Yellowstone has had important impact on other animals and plants. Do you have evidence of the introduction of bird populations on other animals and plants in that area?
Wow, what an interesting question. Yes, there are follow-on impacts, but they're generally positive. So in most cases, the kinds of conservation translocations or social attraction projects that are occurring are attempting to restore seabirds. So they were once a part of those landscapes. And the types of interactions, the types of effects that we're looking for, the types of effects that we are having are desired. Sometimes we lose a little bit of vegetation, but the trade-off is we get increased marine nutrient deposition into the environment. So yes, absolutely, there are ecosystem effects, but they're often desired. In some cases, there have been trade-offs between seabird species that have happened, and managers face difficult decisions in terms of how do I, particularly around rarer species, how do I ensure that the rarer species, which have fewer in number, are not outcompeted by more abundant species? And we faced questions like that in Hawaii around Newell's shearwater. We were attempting to have them return to some parts of the coast, but the more abundant and more aggressive wedge-tailed shearwater would sometimes be a competitor for burrowing habitat. And so we had to figure out how to navigate that and do the trade-offs, do the cost-benefit equations that natural resource management has to do. Excellent question. Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you for that question, Bill. And so I'm curious, can you, Alex, you mentioned a little bit about, the political dynamics that it's important to keep in mind. Kind of in a similar vein, can you tell us a little bit about the role that local communities may or may not play in these conservation efforts on these islands?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are many different dimensions in which local communities can interact with the projects and inform and support. For one, seabirds, not all, but a lot of seabirds have, when they're in their land phase of their daily lives, they're coastal. And so they're occupying also the most heavily populated parts of our islands. Most islands with human populations, those human populations are located adjacent to the coast or on the coast. And so working with local communities to understand the importance of seabirds, both from a cultural perspective, and that's working with them so that they can tell us what their cultural connections are to the seabirds, so we can understand that. And then also working with the local communities to understand and uncover the linkages that Nick has talked to a couple times. So when you're protecting a seabird population, you're not just protecting that species, which is in itself, a valuable cause. You're protecting that ecosystem function that species is providing. And in a lot of these cases, there's a very meaningful and direct link to the productivity and health of a nearshore marine system. So when we're working on tropical oceanic islands where seabirds have been displaced, one thing the concept we're trying to socialize and normalize is that protecting and restoring and protecting seabird populations also is a way to restore and protect your reef ecosystem, which provides nutrients, provides protein for human populations which are foraging on the reef. And it also can be a source of economic stimulus from ecotourism. So restored seabird populations equal healthier reef, which equals more food and more economic opportunity.
Yeah, and so I mean, it just goes to show that, you know, like the previous question, it's about the conservation efforts for their own ends, but it's also about all the other things that these conservation effort that comes with them, and all the extra benefits that it provides. So as you're pulling together this database, were there any seabird restoration efforts that surprised you, either in their effectiveness or lack thereof, or just their, you know, their innovation and trying something new that you never thought of?
That's a great question. And, you know, we're very, like all good conservation science, this effort was the product of an amazing partnership. And there's a really, we have people on the product partnership team. So if you go to the website, you can see the organizations that were involved. And they include the National Audubon Society, and this includes Steve Kress, who's the man on the puffin cereal box. It includes practitioners in Hawaii, including groups like Pacific Rim Conservation, which do quite amazing work there, and people in New Zealand, particularly the New Zealand Department of Conservation, which pioneered some of this work. And so each of us came to this with sort of different perspectives of what would stand out. So they would probably answer these questions in different ways. Mm-hmm. But I do know that the number of social attraction projects for terns on artificial structures, particularly on the West Coast, in river systems and so forth, were a surprise for people, how much that was occurring. And then what was also pleasantly surprising is to learn about projects occurring in parts of the world where English is not first language. So we learned about projects in Asia, for example, that were really fantastic to learn about. This was the first time that we'd ever sort of come across these. At least they were brand new for me. And so it was really exciting to see the different ways in which these occurred. And we were very fortunate to have this partnership to help make those calls about, well, what was unique and what is different, and how might that feed into our general conclusions about what's happening.
So you have that qualitative element as well as the quantitative.
We do, yes. There's very much there's an art and a science to conservation, and this included both.
So we have a question from Caleb Spiegel. How do projects get added to the restoration database? Predator management and invasives control can also be an important part of restoration, even without translocation. Are these projects also included in the database?
A fantastic question and a really important observation for conservation. So if you would like to add a seabird restoration event to the database, you can go to that website, and there's a Gmail link there where you can, I think we even actually have a form now where you can upload some details. In terms of predator management, absolutely. As Alex alluded to earlier, for Palmyra, Palmyra is unique in that it is predator-free. And one of the first questions that a natural resource manager would have to ask themselves about a seabird restoration effort is that a safe habitat to move animals into? And so if there is an invasive predator, like a cat or a rat population on that island, then seabird restoration may not be the appropriate action right now. Instead, the baseline restoration activity is removing that threat. And so the database doesn't reflect invasive and predator removal unless it is in tangent with that seabird restoration activity. However, there are other resources that do highlight predator management around the globe in a very similar way. And we'd be happy to share some of those resources as well.
Great. Yeah, we can definitely share those resources, if not in the chat now, also in our follow-up email that will include the recording of this webinar as well. And so can y'all talk a little bit about what the impacts of warming oceans or, you know, other side effects of climate change are on seabird populations?
Definitely. So we can think about that in a number of different ways. When we think about if we think about the dichotomy of seabird life history, where they breed on land, but they forage at sea, we can think about the impacts in those two parts of their life. So on land, we can project that sea level rise, and even before sea level rise happens, storm surge is a key threat to low-level islands with breeding habitat. It leads to erosion, it leads to loss of nesting sites and so forth. And so that's going to be a key impact. Also on some of the, on the terrestrial side of things, the temperature itself may lead to increased energetic expenditure for birds. If it's simply too hot or it's too windless, then some of these birds will spend more energy to do simple tasks. Well, not simple by any means, but in order to achieve incubation and chick rearing. On the water side of things, we are going to see changes to the foraging dynamics. Some birds may have to travel further in order to access their forage. And we can expect that there will be changes. So, for example, on both the east and the west coast of the United States and Canada and Mexico, we're going to see changes in how the currents will move. We don't know exactly all the details of how that's going to happen, but we do know that we're starting to see some of those changes already, not just to seabirds, but to other marine organisms, where during warm spells, species from the south are pushing further north than we've otherwise seen before. And sometimes they are persisting. So we're seeing changes in distribution. And of course, I'm sure people are familiar with terrestrial equivalents, where some species are pushing further north in their ranges. Alex, let me give you a chance there to fill in some of the gaps that I'm missing.
No, that was really comprehensive. The one interesting change that I think of sometimes, which we're just starting to wrap our heads around, is it involves what's called facilitated foraging. And so this is where seabirds, you know, one of the most interesting thing about seabirds is the first part of their general descriptive name, which is sea. So they're a bird species which hasn't all seabirds breed on land, whether it's islands or coastal continental areas or inland lakes and river habitat. But seabirds forage at sea, or they forage in a water body. If they're, you know, a gull foraging on Salt Lake, then they're obviously not out in the ocean, but they're foraging in the water. And so when they're doing that, they're interacting with non-land species. And in the ocean, and where we work a lot in the Pacific Ocean, a number of seabird species directly interact with pelagic fish species that are really important to those ecosystems, but also really important to people, like tuna. And so there's this really important interaction that's going on with tuna species and seabirds around the smaller fish that are called bait fish that both tuna and seabirds forage on. And that tuna, you know, tuna schools drive the bait fish towards the surface, and then the seabirds are able to then access those bait fish because the tuna and sharks and other dolphins have schooled up the bait fish. But as our harvesting pressure increases on tuna and tuna populations become smaller and more greatly dispersed, and when you layer in climate change on top of that, and changing ocean conditions, changing ocean currents, as Nick was just talking about, that whole sort of facilitated foraging dynamic could potentially change, and could change in a very interesting way. We don't exactly know how yet, but I think that's a space to watch moving forward, is this interplay between large-scale fisheries, pelagic fisheries, and seabirds, and what's happening with that interaction and what's happening there with climate change. So sorry, I didn't give an example. I just kind of raised another question, but that's something that that when we're working with seabirds and we're looking at the ways that they're interacting with other components of these land sea ecosystems, that's one that's of high interest to me moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that, those answers brings up another question for me. Nick, you alluded to, like the East Coast, and we have folks who are, dialing in today from all over the world. But I know that we have a lot of folks who are in Massachusetts. And so I'm wondering if, I know that y'all work out on the West Coast, right? So, but I'm wondering if there's, if you could expand at all on, how the dynamics might differ on the East Coast or in the New England area. And if you just have any, insights or experiences to share along those lines.
Well, I'd actually point to some of the work that our partners on the database are doing. So the National Audubon Society, and in particular their Seabird program, which works up in Maine, so not far from you all, where there's been one of the key characteristics of many seabirds is a very long life history. So when we think about K-selected and R-selected species, they're very much on this K-selection, where they have few young, and it takes them a long time before they have their first attempt at breeding, and they live a long time. And what that means from a management perspective is it's quite difficult, because you need to monitor for a long time in order to see change. And so we're very fortunate that partners like these that I alluded to do have long-term monitoring underway, where for decades now they've been able to follow key species like puffins in order to understand the foraging dynamics on an annual basis, their reproductive success on an annual basis. And there is a little bit of a transect, if you like, because they're following in different places. So the different islands are in different locations within different foraging areas. And so you're able to compare them within a season. So it's these kinds of monitoring efforts that allow us to see what's happening more effectively and with more rigor and more confidence, to understand how climate change is touching down in different places. So this is how this work is happening on the East Coast. As far as what the trend is, I can't give you a straight answer. But Alex, are you familiar with some work out there?
My mind first went to work that's happening in the Caribbean with the petrels, the dark black-capped petrel. Is that correct? Yeah, I was thinking of. Yeah, and then also the work as well up in Maine and on the offshore islands there. But yeah, I'm admittedly not as familiar with the seabird conservation work off the East Coast, but I do know that it's a robust community and a robust field, and it's been the seabird conservation from the seabird conferences, that seabird focused conferences that I've attended over the last decade. Quite a few projects from the East Coast are presented, and it's been a mainstay of seabird conservation for a long time.
So I want to get to a question here from Caleb Spiegel. And so Caleb says, seabird restoration is often mentioned as the biggest bang for the buck / most straightforward strategy in compensatory mitigation to restore impacts elsewhere, e.g. oil spills and wind energy development. For species that have limited breeding ranges, do you think there are enough opportunities to use this sort of mitigation as a strategy for impacted species to recover from multiple threats, or might this strategy be limited? And let me know if I should repeat any part of that question for you. There's a lot here. Thank you, Caleb.
No, that's an excellent question. And yes, there are lots of examples of seabird restoration being used as compensatory mitigation. Here in the California current, oil spill funding has been used to for a variety of activities, not just translocations, but eradication. So clearing habitat of invasive predators like rats has been a successful way to bring these birds back. And in those cases, so for just by way of example, a project that I'm very familiar with here is Anacapa Island in the Channel Islands. Rats were eradicated in 2001 and 2002. It's multiple islands, and so it was a staggered operation. And almost immediately, there was a positive response by a very important seabird, the Scripps' murrelet, which at the time was known as the Xanthus murrelet. Now, the Xanthus murrelet was one of the birds that was picked up in the oil spill as an impacted species. And so that was the mechanism that allowed that project to be funded. In that case, there was no need for social attraction or chick translocation because there was a remnant population in the sea caves. It was sort of the last holdout, if you like, of the murrelets. And by removing the threat of rats, it allowed this bird to naturally recover on its own. Remarkably, there's also been other spills in the California current that have funded restoration work in New Zealand. So sooty shearwaters have been picked up in oil spills, and that has provided a mechanism for money to be transferred to New Zealand to undertake sort of equivalent restoration exercises. You're pointing out a really key question. Is there enough, ideally we'd never have these oil spills in the first place, and ideally rats would never have made it to these islands, and so on and so on. But that's not the world that we live in, unfortunately. For some species, yes, there will be opportunity, and it can be as simple as returning them to their original island, like we talked about with Anacapa. But there's also lots of species that are quite endemic to one island. And so if that one island is unfeasible to do appropriate restoration work, and we're looking to create insurance populations, where are we going to put them? And so we are faced with novel and perhaps difficult decisions. Can we put them outside of their range? And there's been some really interesting developments here in the US. The National Park Service, for example, earlier this year or late last year, released a science document where they call managed introduction. So the National Park Service recognizes that climate change is going to force them to think outside the boundaries of their parks. And what that means is some species are going to move outside of the park, and new species are potentially going to move into the park. And so how should they best prepare for those scenarios? So in that case, moving a species outside of its natural range is being considered a managed introduction. And the National Park Service in that document proposed a risk assessment framework for how to undertake those types of decisions. So your question was primarily around compensatory mitigation. Do we have enough locations to do this kind of work? And those types of questions are being asked not just around oil spills and wind energy, but also around climate change. And so I think that there's good lessons learned that transfer across those places. And your question alludes to some of the really core challenges that we have in conservation, and it's about cost benefit. It's about risk evaluation. Sometimes there will be decisions where there are trade-offs, and we need to be able to undertake those types of assessments, looking at not just the biological values, but also the social and the cultural values as well. And so it's really important that we undertake those decisions as rigorously as we can.
So I want to try to squeeze in just one more question here. And that is, just projecting forward, What do you envision for this project 5 or 10 years from now? And could this program be replicated for other species?
That's a great question. Yeah, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And when I say we, not just TNC, not just Alex and myself, but the conservation community. So you're very fortunate. This work that we're doing is very hot off the press. We are about to submit a paper for peer-reviewed publication. And we want to go through the process of disseminating. So the whole point of pulling this inventory together was to begin to share it with practitioners. And we think there's lots of opportunity to improve the distribution of the work that we've done, and also to go about sharing that in a very real way with a practitioner to practitioner knowledge exchange. And we want to be able to look at, well, which birds and which opportunities need this the most, and which birds and which opportunities have the highest feasibility of doing that. And so absolutely, there is a lot of opportunity and a lot of need to replicate these kinds of actions on the ground. So we Alex and myself and our colleagues expect to continue working in this science innovation space and in delivering these conservation projects on the ground in order, not for seabirds, and I'll come back to a statement I said earlier, it's not seabirds, not just as conservation targets, but seabirds as conservation partners in order to achieve good outcomes for islands around the world. Alex, what do you think?
I don't want to sully that last statement you just made, Nick. That was really good. I mean, seabirds are and have been very important conservation targets, but they're also our partners in this effort. And so, yeah, and I think that this database is one example of how we can sort of amplify lessons learned and what strategies have been successful to increase the rate, the scope and the scale of this kind of conservation intervention. And it's not just applicable to seabirds. You could apply this to plants that need to find new homes or be restored within their current ranges. And so it's definitely not taxon specific.
Awesome. So we're approaching the end of our time today. So Alex, Nick, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
Thank you. Thank you for joining. It's always fun to talk about this. Many of the birds that we've been able to share stories about are birds that we have personal connections to. And so they're with us all here today in spirit. As we mentioned, we have a busy portfolio of work ahead of us, and we do have a funding gap. And so we are keen to learn how we can work with others in order to continue the good work that we do with our partners, both on the database and on the ground, implementing these seabird restoration efforts.
All right, well, Alex, Nick, thank you both so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is really what makes all of this work possible. So we will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. And if you're enjoying our webinars, please share them with your friends. So you can follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram, and conserve_MA, no underscore, on Twitter, to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. So we'll be taking a break for the rest of August. So we hope that everyone enjoys the rest of their summer. We will be back in September, so keep an eye out in your email and on our website at nature.org/MA webinars for the schedule as it becomes available. Thank you so much again for joining us, Nick and Alex, and everyone out there, and have a wonderful afternoon.